This week is all about an alternative kind of pedagogy that's not often used but is worth entertaining, and it's called Socratic Pedagogy. I can actually speak with some competence on this because I've actually run Socratic classes where the class is entirely Socratic. So we'll explain how that works, and I might add it works to really good effect, at least when I run it. And you're going to also listen to an educator named Michael Strong, who's run this in middle school, elementary school, high school levels, things like that. So he's a real big champion enthusiast of it. So what is Socratic pedagogy? Well, we already read some excerpts from Paulo Freire, and we know that Freire is very dissatisfied with the current state of education, how it works. So, and Freire's problem is really with the lecture method of content delivery, what he calls the banking method, which he says is a very one-way idea, right? The teacher stands up and lectures based on what the teacher, knows that the student needs. And then the student's job is to kind of serve as a receptacle for that knowledge. They write down notes, they go home and study the notes, they memorize what the teacher wants them to memorize, and then they show mastery of that. Well, the Socratic method is much more like what Freire starts to talk about as the problem-posing model of education. So in order to get students to think about material and to really absorb material, we need to get them to think about problems. But in order to do that, the lecture method isn't terribly efficient. So the Socratic method is named after a philosopher named Socrates. Socrates never wrote anything down during his lifetime in ancient Greece, but one of his students, Plato, after Socrates' death, decided, when I write philosophical treatises, I'm going to write them in the style of Socrates. So what he did was write out dialogues that Socrates would have with students. And the dialogues are interesting because Socrates was this really knowledgeable philosopher. But what Socrates never did was told students the answer to questions. So Socrates never said, okay, class, sit down with me. We're going to talk about what justice is. And I'm going to explain to you what justice is in this lecture. And then you're going to memorize kind of my lectures, what justice is. What Socrates would do instead is get together with students and say, okay, we have this question. What is justice? What do you guys think justice is? And then one student would say, well, I think it's probably something like this, and here's my reasons. And Socrates would say, okay, interesting. What do you guys think? Do you think is that pretty accurate? And Socrates might even say, I don't know if that's right, because you could argue against this. What do you think of that argument? Do you think that's compelling? And then the student or other students would argue about whether it's compelling, whether the objection is compelling, and maybe another student would formulate another idea of justice. Okay, well maybe what we just said, that's not justice, but maybe what justice is this. And then Socrates would do the same thing. Okay, what do you think? But Socrates would never let his own opinions be known. His goal was to get students thinking about what the answers might be, and I think his fear, like most Socratic pedagogists or pedagogues, the fear is that once the teacher gives any sort of lecture, that ends the conversation. Students feel like, okay, we know what the answer is, I can memorize that. So Socratic pedagogy in this day and age and how I run it looks something like this. Students and I will do a common thing for homework, let's say. Usually it's reading from a common text. Sometimes it's watching like a video that you guys might watch. Sometimes it's simply thinking about a question. I want you guys to go home and think about this question. Try to formulate your best answer to that question, and we'll talk about it next class. And what we'll do is we'll come into class then, and we usually want to organize the group in some sort of circular form or some sort of square form. It doesn't work very well if students are all looking at me and I'm looking at the students. We all want to be in a situation where we're kind of looking at each other. I also find it good to have name cards. So we actually have name cards that we put on our desks so that when we're talking to other people, we can use their names. And then in class, either a student throws out maybe an answer to a question or a question they had about a reading, and we'll all talk about it. So the question might be, the author says this on page 62, but I don't know about that. What does he mean by that? Is that correct? I don't think it is. Here's my argument. And then we'll spend time talking about that. Or if there's silence, my job will be to interject. So let's say students might disagree on a particular meaning of a passage. And the passage has to do with, I don't know, let's say the idea of authority. So let's say they're reading Theodore Sizer's book, and they disagree on the type of authority that's most effective. So my job as a teacher at that point is to say, okay, let's step back for a second. What is authority? What does it mean when one person has authority over another? And then we'll start talking about that. So I kind of steer the discussion that way. I don't interject my own opinions on this. I just ask students. And then maybe we figure out what authority is. And then there's another lull in the conversation. So I'll say something like, okay, where does authority come from? If a person has authority over another person, we know what that is. But where does authority come from? Or where can authority come from? And then we'll start talking about that until we get back to the Sizer passage. And then we can start talking about the disagreements about the Sizer passage, or something like that. So one thing that's interesting about the Socratic method and Socratic pedagogy that ties it to what we've done in past weeks is it really does focus on questions of authority. Authority is really tricky in a Socratic situation. At the end of the day, I'm still the teacher. Everyone knows that. I have the title of teacher. It's my class that everyone's taking. I have the grade book, things like that. But when we're having the discussion, and this is one of the ways it differs from the lecture method, when we're having the discussion, I'm not really the authority. And it's really hard to pull off because people still see me in some ways as the authority. So one of my classes was actually talking about the Sizer chapters that we've read. And at some point, inevitably, students will look at me and say, so my understanding of what Sizer's getting at is this. Is that right? And as a Socratic practitioner, it's really hard to not put on the teacher role and say, no, that's not right. Here's the right interpretation, or yes, that's right. Let's keep going. I have to say, well, what do you guys think? At best, I could say, well, my read on it is this, but I don't know if that's correct. What do you all think? Is that different from your perspective? Really hard to do as a teacher, right? Because we're used to that more one-way model where I know what's going to happen, and the students have to follow my lead. The other thing it really deals with in terms of Sizer is the idea of order. And I'll give you an example of this. I had an observation. Some other professors were going to come in and observe my classroom. And before they do that, they like to know, what are we going to see in your classroom? What are you guys doing today? And to some degree, with Socratic pedagogy, you don't always know what's going to happen in class. All I could tell them is, here's what we were reading, and here's the kinds of questions I think we might discuss. But other than that, I can't really tell much. So Sizer, remember, has that distinction between order and the appearance of order. So the appearance of order might be, I could tell you every 10 minutes what we're supposed to be doing, every 15 minutes what we're going to be doing. And I can tell you at the end of class that here's what the students will have done. And in some ways that's order, and that's a valid type of order. And it definitely gives the appearance of order. But there's also another type of order, which is a kind of self-created order. So think about Socratic pedagogy as simply a long conversation. A conversation can't be a conversation if I know where it's going to end up in advance. At that point, it's not a conversation. It's me steering you to where I want you to go. A Socratic seminar, of course, in some ways I do have to steer people, but I don't know where I'm going to have to steer people in advance. So it's an order, but it's an order that's determined by the group as a whole. One student might want to steer the conversation this way and we'll go there. One student might want to steer the conversation this way and we'll go there. But it's not an order that's planned out in advance. So one of the last things about Socratic pedagogy is it sounds kind of like a cop-out in some ways. It sounds like the teacher isn't really doing a whole lot. And in some ways it's true. So some classes I've not done Socratic pedagogy, and I come in with kind of activities and lectures planned. It's a more planned out class. But when I do Socratic pedagogy, I almost never have to come in with a concrete plan for the day other than maybe some questions about the readings that we might want to talk about or something like that. So is Socratic pedagogy in some ways kind of a cop-out? Not really. And the reason we think it is because we're used to that kind of order where it's not order unless you know where it's going in advance. So if I don't know where everything's going in advance, we realize, well, that doesn't seem like order. So you're not really doing a whole lot as a teacher. But in a lot of ways, you have to do a lot as a teacher. I have to know the subject and the material that we're looking at so well that I am prepared for any situation that could possibly arise. Now think of yourselves as a teacher. That's in some ways kind of terrifying. Think about coming in without a lesson plan and having to kind of improvise your way through it. You have to be prepared for any situation that comes up. A student might understand certain things in a way that you think is wrong. You have to figure out how you would deal with that. You have to be prepared enough to do that. So you're not really preparing for that class in terms of, an ironclad lesson plan every 10 to 15 minutes. We know what we're doing. But you really do have to be pretty comfortable in your subject and in the material enough that you can guide students without planning in advance. And the very last thing about Socratic pedagogy that I think is going to be interesting to talk about is people are going to have the question, well, that sounds great for like a college level or high school level. What about elementary and middle level? So in the folder, I'm going to put some examples of online, and you can search online yourself for examples of Socratic seminars being run at the elementary level, at the middle school level, at the high school level, and at the college level. Now, you don't do the Socratic seminar the same way. Obviously, I can't have students in elementary school read Rousseau or Ted Sizer and then talk about it. But you can have them do certain things. And you'll see examples of that in the group. And I guess the very last thing, sorry, I lied. The very last thing to finish off with is, why is this a good thing to do? Well, a lot of research in the past 30 or so years has really started to appreciate how active a thing understanding is. So if I want students to understand something, it is much more than them passively receiving a lecture and then understanding it and then demonstrating mastery. To understand something, I have to play a very active role. First of all, I have to interpret what you're saying. The interpretation of what you're telling me isn't always going to be obvious. There's going to be some cases where the words are vague, the idea is vague. I have to make sense. Think about that, active, make sense of what you're saying. So that's an active thing already. But another thing that I have to do to understand is play around with my understanding a bit. Okay, so if I'm understanding this properly, then this would be the result. Is that right? Or should I understand it this way? You have to in some ways play around with that understanding, and that's an active process. It's also a social process. You want to be doing that with other people, the teacher, other students. And the last thing that is an active part of understanding is the idea that to understand anything really well, I have to not only understand it, I have to incorporate it into my larger web of knowledge. So in science class, to understand how cells work, you have to understand maybe by analogy. So I know how parts of a city work together, or I know how parts of a family work together. So maybe I can understand a cell by making an analogy to the family or to a city. But those are all active processes. And in order to understand, I have to be able to actively play a part in my understanding. It's more than the lecture model can provide. So that's my not so brief intro to Socratic pedagogy. And you'll hear from some advocates of Socratic pedagogy, some people talking about Socratic pedagogy, and I also have examples of folks from elementary, middle, and high school level all doing Socratic pedagogy and all doing it slightly differently.